The cranberry sauce was still warm in my hands when my husband destroyed 35 years of marriage with 7 words. Maggie always was a peso muerto in this family. The ceramic serving bowl slipped from my fingers, hitting the hardwood floor of our dining room with a sound like a gunshot. Cranberry sauce splattered across the Persian rug Tom's mother had given us for our 10th anniversary. The same rug I'd hand-cleaned twice a year for 25 years. The same rug where our children had taken their first steps, where we'd unwrapped Christmas presents and celebrated graduations and pretended we were happy. The laughter started immediately. My son David, 32 and too much like his father, snorted into his wine glass. My daughter Sarah covered her mouth, but I could see her shoulders shaking with suppressed giggles. Even my youngest, Michael, just turned 27, was grinning as he helped himself to more stuffing. But it was my daughter-in-law Jennifer who laughed the loudest, throwing her head back like Tom had just delivered the punchline to the world's funniest joke. "Oh my God, Tom, that's terrible," she gasped between giggles. "But so accurate." I stood frozen beside the table I'd spent 2 days preparing, wearing the apron I'd embroidered with autumn leaves last September, surrounded by the people I'd devoted my entire adult life to serving. The turkey I'd been basting since 4 in the morning sat golden and perfect in the center of the table. The homemade rolls were still warm from the oven. The sweet potato casserole with the marshmallow topping that took 3 hours to prepare properly steamed gently in its crystal dish. My grandmother's crystal dish. The one I'd promised myself I'd pass down to Sarah someday. All of it ignored while my family laughed at the joke that was my life. "Peso morto," Tom repeated, savoring the Portuguese phrase he'd learned from his golf buddy Carlos. "Dead weight. That's what you are, Maggie. Always have been. Dragging us down with your little hobbies and your crazy ideas." The crazy idea he was referring to had been mentioned exactly once, tentatively, hopefully, during the appetizer course, a small bed and breakfast. Something I'd been dreaming about since the children left home 3 years ago. I'd even found a property, a Victorian house in Vermont that needed renovation, but had good bones, character, potential. "I think it could be wonderful," I'd said quietly, passing the cheese board that had taken me an hour to arrange properly. With the kids grown, we could start fresh, travel, meet new people. I could finally use my hospitality degree. The hospitality degree I'd earned at 38, taking night classes while working part-time and still managing to have dinner on the table every evening by 6:30. The degree I'd never been able to use because someone needed to drive Sarah to soccer practice, or David to debate team, or Michael to guitar lessons, or Tom to the airport for another business trip where he'd come home exhausted and expectant, waiting for me to massage the tension from his shoulders and listen to his complaints about demanding clients. "A bed and breakfast," Tom had said, cutting into his perfectly prepared turkey with surgical precision. "With what money, Maggie? With what business experience? You've never run anything more complicated than a PTA fundraiser." "I ran the church charity auction for 8 years, I'd said, hating how defensive I sounded. "I organized the community food drive that raised over $50,000. I managed the household budget through 3 recessions and still saved enough to—" "That's not the same as running a business," David had interrupted, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone he'd inherited from his father. "Mom, you can't just decide to become an entrepreneur at 64. That's not how the real world works." "Besides," Sarah had added, not looking up from her phone where she was undoubtedly posting pictures of my carefully prepared meal to Instagram without credit, "you'd hate dealing with strangers all the time. You're not exactly social." Not social. The woman who'd hosted dinner parties for Tom's colleagues for 3 decades, who'd organized neighborhood block parties and school fundraisers and charity galas, who'd been the perfect political wife during Tom's brief stint as city councilman, smiling and making small talk and remembering everyone's names and their children's accomplishments. But I'd learned long ago that my family had a remarkable ability to forget my contributions the moment they were no longer convenient. "It was just an idea," I'd said finally, reaching for my wine glass and noticing how my hand trembled slightly. "Something to think about for the future." That's when Tom had delivered his verdict. Peso morto. Dead weight. And they'd all laughed. Now I stood in the ruins of my Thanksgiving dinner, cranberry sauce seeping into the antique rug, while my family continued their meal as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just reduced 35 years of my life to a punchline. "Maggie," Tom said without looking up from his plate, You gonna clean that up or just stand there all night? I looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in years. Tom Walsh, 67 years old, silver-haired and still handsome, in the way that middle-aged men with money and confidence often were. The same man who'd swept me off my feet at a college mixer in 1985, who'd promised me adventures and partnership and a life full of possibilities. Somewhere along the way, those promises had transformed into expectations. I'd cook, clean, manage, organize, facilitate, and disappear. I'd become the invisible infrastructure that kept his life running smoothly, so invisible that my own family couldn't imagine me as anything else. Actually, Tom, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, I think I'll leave it. I untied my autumn leaf apron, the one I'd spent hours embroidering while watching Tom's detective shows, the one that had seemed so festive this morning when I'd put on my good earrings and hoped for a pleasant family dinner, and dropped it on top of the cranberry mess. What the hell is wrong with you? Tom's voice carried the edge it got when his routine was disrupted. This is your grandmother's rug. Yes, it is. I walked to the coat closet and pulled out my navy wool coat, the one I'd bought 3 years ago but rarely wore because Tom said it made me look like I was trying too hard. And now it's yours to clean. Mom? Michael's voice held the first note of uncertainty I'd heard from him all evening. Where are you going? I paused at the front door, looking back at my family. They sat around my table, under my grandmother's chandelier, in the dining room I'd decorated and maintained and loved, looking at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into their lives by accident. Maybe I was. I'm going to find out if I'm really dead weight, I said, pulling on the leather gloves I'd received last Christmas from Sarah. Practical, brown, forgettable gloves that matched exactly what she thought of me. Or if you've all just forgotten what it feels like to carry yourselves. I walked out into the November evening, leaving the door open behind me so they could hear my car engine starting, could hear me backing out of the driveway of the house I'd called home for 28 years. I drove through our quiet neighborhood where every house was lit with the warm glow of family dinners and football games, where other women my age were probably loading dishwashers and wrapping leftovers and pretending their lives were exactly what they'd always dreamed they would be. But I didn't go home to our empty house with its perfectly coordinated throw pillows and spotless kitchen and guest room that was always ready for visitors who rarely came. Instead, I drove to the Marriott on the edge of town, checked into a room with a view of the interstate, and sat on the generic hotel bed with my phone in my hands. The text came from Tom at 11:30. This is ridiculous. Come home. At midnight. Maggie, you're embarrassing yourself. At 12:30. Fine. Sulk all you want, but you're paying for that hotel room yourself. I turned off my phone and opened my laptop. The Victorian house in Vermont was still for sale. I'd been secretly checking the listing every week for 2 months, memorizing the photographs of the wraparound porch and the tower room that would make a perfect reading nook for guests. But Vermont suddenly felt too close, too small, too much like the life I was trying to escape. I opened a new browser window and typed 6 words that changed everything. Remote property for sale, Alaska. The photographs that filled my screen showed endless skies and untouched wilderness, mountains that had never heard my family's laughter at my expense, lakes that reflected possibilities instead of limitations. By 3 a.m, I'd found it. 50 acres on the edge of nowhere, 4 hours from Anchorage, with a log cabin that needed work and a view that needed nothing but appreciation. By 4 a.m, I'd transferred the down payment from the savings account Tom didn't know I had, the inheritance from my parents that I'd been carefully investing for 15 years while he'd been making jokes about my grocery money. By sunrise, I was driving north toward a life that would finally fit the woman I'd always been, underneath the apron and the expectations and the weight of other people's limitations. Tom was right about one thing. I had been carrying dead weight for 35 years, but it hadn't been me. The real estate agent's voice crackled through my cell phone like distant thunder, professional concern barely masking what I suspected was genuine alarm. Mrs. Walsh, I have to ask, are you certain about this decision? Purchasing property sight unseen is always risky, but Alaska... Patricia Meadows paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. Well, it's not exactly retirement country for most people. I stood at the window of my hotel room, watching the Kansas sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, and smiled for the first time in months. Ms. Meadows, I've spent 35 years making safe decisions. How's that worked out for me? I understand, but this particular property is quite remote. The nearest neighbor is 12 miles away. The access road isn't maintained by the state, and the cabin, while structurally sound, hasn't been occupied in 3 years. Perfect. Another pause. The seller is asking for a quick closing. Cash only as is condition. No inspections, no contingencies. It's unusual for someone of your demographic, my demographic. 64-year-old woman, probably divorced, probably desperate, probably making an emotional decision she'd regret when reality set in. Patricia was being kind by not saying it directly. Ms. Meadows, I've wired the full purchase price to your escrow account. The property is mine as of 9 this morning, correct? Yes, ma'am. Congratulations, I suppose. Though I do hope you'll consider hiring local contractors before attempting any major renovations. The climate up there can be challenging. As if 35 years of marriage to Tom Walsh hadn't been excellent preparation for challenging climates. After ending the call, I sat on the hotel bed and stared at my phone, scrolling through 17 text messages I hadn't answered. Tom's anger had evolved overnight from irritation to outrage to what appeared to be genuine panic. Maggie, this has gone far enough. The kids are worried sick. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it. Just come home. I'm calling Dr. Harrison. You're clearly having some kind of breakdown. Dr. Harrison, our family physician for 20 years, who'd prescribed antidepressants when I'd mentioned feeling invisible, who'd suggested hormone therapy when I'd complained about feeling restless, who'd recommended couples counseling when I'd dared to voice dissatisfaction with my marriage, counseling that Tom had refused, claiming our problems were all in Maggie's head. The final text had arrived at 6 in the morning. Maggie, please. I didn't mean what I said. Come home and we'll talk about the bed and breakfast idea. I deleted the messages without responding and called the number I'd found online at 2 in the morning. Northern Lights, Moving and Storage. This is Jake. I need everything in my house packed and shipped to Alaska. Today. A pause. Ma'am, it's 5 in the morning. I'm sorry. I meant I need it scheduled for today. I can pay extra for the rush service. Alaska's a big place. Where in Alaska? I gave him the address I'd memorized, watching him whistle low through the phone. That's remote. Gonna cost you extra for the distance, and we'll need to coordinate with a local company up there for the final delivery. Whatever it costs. You moving the whole house? I considered this question, thinking about the dining room set where my family had laughed at me last night, the king-size bed where Tom had been falling asleep before I finished speaking for the last 5 years, the living room furniture arranged around a television that played his shows on his schedule. No, just my things, my books, my clothes, my grandmother's china, my craft supplies, everything else stays. What about furniture? I'll buy new furniture. Furniture that fits who I am now, not who I used to be. After scheduling the movers, I drove to our house, my former house, arriving at 7:30 to find Tom's Cadillac still in the driveway. He'd taken the day off work, something he'd done exactly 3 times in our entire marriage, when each of our children was born. I used my key quietly, surprised by how foreign my own home felt after just 1 night away. The cranberry sauce stain was gone from the dining room rug. Tom must have called our cleaning service, but the table still held the remnants of our Thanksgiving disaster. Dirty plates, serving dishes with congealed food, wine glasses with dark residue in the bottom. The scene of my humiliation left for me to clean up. I found Tom in the kitchen, standing at the coffee maker in his bathrobe, his silver hair disheveled and his face bearing the kind of hangover pallor that suggested he'd finished the wine after I left. Thank God, he said when he saw me. Maggie, we need to talk. This whole thing has gotten out of hand. Has it? I opened the cabinet where I kept my travel mugs and selected my favorite, a ceramic piece decorated with vintage maps that Sarah had given me years ago, back when she still thought my dreams of travel were charming rather than embarrassing. Of course it has. Running off to a hotel like a teenager having a tantrum. What will the neighbors think? I poured coffee into my travel mug, adding cream from the refrigerator I'd organized and restocked hundreds of times. I don't know, Tom. What do you think they'll think? I think they'll think my wife has lost her mind. He moved closer, and I caught the familiar scent of his aftershave mixed with wine and fear. Maggie, I know I said some things last night. We all did. But you know how family dinners get. Everyone's tired. Maybe we had too much wine. Dead weight. What? That's what you called me, dead weight. In Portuguese, so it would sound more clever, more cutting. Tom's face flushed red. I was joking, Maggie. It was a joke. You know I didn't mean... Which part was the joke? The part where you said I'd always been dead weight? Or the part where our children laughed about it? They weren't laughing at you, they were laughing at me, Tom. Just like you've been laughing at me for years. Every time I mentioned going back to school, or starting a business, or traveling somewhere that wasn't a pre-planned vacation to the same resort we visited 8 times. I walked past him toward the stairs, heading for the bedroom to collect the personal items the movers would need to identify. Where are you going now? Tom's voice carried the edge of a man who was accustomed to controlling situations and found himself suddenly powerless. Upstairs. To pack. Pack for what? How long is this little rebellion going to last? I stopped halfway up the stairs, looking down at the man I'd promised to love and honor until death do us part. He stood in our kitchen wearing the silk bathrobe I'd given him for his birthday, surrounded by the breakfast dishes I wouldn't be washing. In the house I'd turned into a home he'd taken completely for granted. It's not a rebellion, Tom. It's a divorce. The word hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Maggie, you're 64 years old. You can't just start over. Where would you even go? What would you do? I smiled, thinking about 50 acres of untouched wilderness where no one had ever called me dead weight, where no one expected me to disappear into the background of my own life. I'm going to find out what it feels like to be the main character in my own story. This is insane. You don't have any money, any skills, I have $380,000 in my personal account, a hospitality degree, 35 years of management experience, and more skills than you've ever bothered to notice. Tom's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. 380. How do you have my parents' inheritance, the money you assumed didn't exist because you never asked about it? The money I've been investing while you've been treating me like unpaid household staff. I climbed the rest of the stairs, leaving Tom standing in his expensive kitchen, finally understanding that the woman he'd taken for granted was about to take herself completely out of his reach. In our bedroom, I pulled out the suitcase I'd bought years ago for a trip to Europe that never happened because Tom decided it was too expensive, too impractical, too much trouble. Now it would carry me 6,000 miles away from everything I'd ever known. The movers arrived at noon, efficient and professional, packing my life into labeled boxes while Tom made increasingly desperate phone calls to our children. I heard fragments of his conversations, explanations about midlife crises and hormonal changes and the need for family intervention. But I also heard something I'd never heard before, genuine fear that I might actually mean what I said. By evening, my possessions were loaded onto a truck heading north. By midnight, I was on a plane to Anchorage, watching the lights of Kansas disappear beneath the clouds. Somewhere over the Canadian border, I opened my laptop and began researching sustainable building practices, ecotourism, and the hospitality industry in Alaska. Dead weight didn't research. Dead weight didn't plan. Dead weight didn't spend the flight designing the life she was going to build from scratch. But Margaret Walsh, not Maggie, not anymore, was about to prove that she'd been carrying everyone else for so long. She'd forgotten how light she could be on her own. The bush pilot who flew me from Anchorage to my new property looked like he'd stepped from a Jack London novel. Grizzled beard, eyes the color of glacier ice, and hands that gripped the controls of his Cessna like he was shaking hands with an old friend. "You sure about this, ma'am?" he shouted over the engine noise as we banked over endless wilderness. "Weather's turning, and that cabin's been empty a long while. Might want to consider staying in town tonight, heading out in the morning." Below us stretched a landscape that seemed to exist beyond the reach of human ambition. Mountains rose like cathedral spires against a sky the color of pewter, their peaks crowned with snow that had never known footprints. Rivers snaked through valleys where the only roads were game trails, where silence wasn't broken by traffic or sirens or the constant hum of civilization demanding attention. "I'm sure," I called back, clutching the armrest as we hit another pocket of turbulence. "I've been waiting my whole life to be sure about something." He gave me a look that suggested he'd transported his share of people running from their lives, and most of them hadn't lasted a winter. But he nodded, and began his descent toward a clearing that seemed impossibly small from the air, barely more than a scar in the vast green canvas of forest. The landing was rougher than anything I'd experienced in 30 years of vacation flights to predictable destinations. The plane bucked and jolted down what I generously supposed was a runway, finally shuddering to a stop in front of a log cabin that looked like it had been carved from the surrounding forest by someone who understood that beauty didn't require ornamentation. "That's her," the pilot said, cutting the engine. "Home sweet home." The cabin was larger than the photographs had suggested. 2 stories of weathered logs with windows that reflected the surrounding wilderness like mirrors. A covered porch wrapped around 3 sides, and I could see the bones of what had once been a garden, now overgrown with wild grasses and late-season wildflowers. But it was the lake that stole my breath. 50 yards from the cabin's front door, water stretched toward the horizon like liquid silver, so still and perfect it seemed to hold the sky captive in its depths. Mountains rose directly from the far shore, their reflection creating a world that existed both above and below the surface, real and mirrored, possible and impossible. "Previous owner was a writer," the pilot said, helping me unload my suitcases. "Came up here to finish some novel, stayed 15 years. Only left when his arthritis got too bad for the winters." "Did he finish it? The novel?" "Heard he wrote 12 of them." Something about the solitude clearing his head, helping him remember who he was underneath all the noise. I stood in front of my new home, purchased with my money, chosen by my judgment, and felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Possibility. The pilot fired up his engine. "I can come back tomorrow, check on you. Make sure you're settling in all right." "That's kind of you, but unnecessary. I have everything I need." He studied my face, perhaps looking for signs of the breakdown Tom was probably describing to anyone who would listen. Instead, he seemed to find something that surprised him. "You know what, ma'am? I think you do." After he lifted off, the silence was so complete it felt like a living thing. No traffic, no sirens, no televisions bleeding through thin walls, no family members needing rides or meals or emotional management, no husband's voice explaining why my dreams were impractical, why my desires were selfish, why my very existence was an inconvenience. Just wind in the pines and the gentle lap of water against the lake shore and the sound of my own breathing, steady and calm and entirely my own. I walked through the cabin slowly, claiming each room with my presence. The previous owner had left it furnished, simple, sturdy pieces that looked like they'd been built to last through whatever storms Alaska could deliver. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, with built-in bookshelves that begged to be filled with stories that mattered. The kitchen was small but functional, with windows that looked out over the lake and mountains that seemed to change color as the light shifted. Upstairs, the master bedroom occupied the entire second floor, with windows on 3 sides and a view that made my Kansas horizon seem cramped and apologetic. This was a room for dreaming big dreams, for planning impossible things, for becoming whoever you were brave enough to become. I unpacked my laptop and sat at the kitchen table, using my phone's hotspot to connect to the outside world. The internet was slow but functional, enough for research, planning, and the business I was already beginning to envision. My inbox was full of increasingly frantic messages from Tom and the children, but I deleted them unread. That conversation would happen when I was ready, on my terms, from a position of strength rather than desperation. Instead, I opened a new document and began typing. Business plan. Northern Lights Wilderness Retreat Mission. To provide discerning travelers with an authentic Alaska experience that combines luxury accommodation with environmental stewardship and respect for local culture. Target market. Executives seeking digital detox. Couples celebrating significant anniversaries, adventure travelers who appreciate comfort, corporate groups needing creative inspiration. I'd studied hospitality management for 6 years, earning my degree while raising 3 children and maintaining a household that could have served as a magazine spread for perfect family living. I'd managed budgets, coordinated events, resolved conflicts, and created experiences that brought people together around shared values. Everything Tom had dismissed as just housework had actually been preparation for this. By midnight, I had 30 pages of detailed plans. Renovations that would transform the cabin into a luxury retreat while preserving its authentic character. marketing strategies that would attract guests willing to pay premium prices for authentic experiences, partnerships with local guides, artisans, and suppliers that would benefit the entire community, a sustainable business model that would provide financial independence while creating something genuinely meaningful. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I hadn't covered with the heavy drapes Tom preferred. Outside, the lake reflected clouds that looked like brushstrokes against canvas, and I understood why the writer had stayed 15 years. I made coffee in the simple kitchen and walked onto the porch, breathing air so clean it seemed to wash my lungs from the inside. A bald eagle circled overhead, and somewhere in the distance I heard the haunting call of loons. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, Tom's number. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message while watching the eagle settle on a dead pine at the water's edge. Maggie, this has gone too far. The kids are worried sick, the neighbors are asking questions, and Dr. Harrison says you might be having a genuine psychological break. I've talked to a lawyer about having you declared, about protecting you from making decisions you'll regret. Just come home. We'll pretend this never happened. I deleted the message and blocked his number. Then I called the construction company I'd researched online, the one with 5-star ratings and a specialty in sustainable building practices. Northern Construction, this is Maria. I'd like to schedule a consultation for a major renovation project. I'm turning a residential cabin into a luxury wilderness retreat. Whereabouts are you located? I gave her the address, hearing her whistle softly through the phone. That's pretty remote. It'll cost extra to get crews and materials out there. That's fine. When can someone come take a look? How about next Tuesday? Fair warning though, winter's coming fast up there. If you want to do any major work, we'd need to start soon and work through some pretty challenging weather. Perfect. I've been dealing with challenging weather my whole life. It's time I built something that can withstand it. After scheduling the consultation, I walked down to the lakeshore and stood at the water's edge, letting the morning silence wash over me like absolution. Somewhere in Kansas, Tom was probably calling lawyers and doctors, trying to find legal ways to drag me back to a life that had never fit, but legal guardianship required proving I was incompetent to make my own decisions. And a woman who just purchased 50 acres of Alaska wilderness, developed a comprehensive business plan, and scheduled major construction work within 48 of arriving, didn't sound particularly incompetent. She sounded like someone who'd finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she actually was. The eagle took flight, circling once before disappearing into the vast blue sky. I had work to do. The construction crew arrived on a Tuesday morning when frost painted the world in silver, their convoy of trucks rumbling down my dirt access road like mechanical thunder. I watched from my kitchen window as they unloaded equipment and materials, these men and women who would help transform my vision into reality. Maria Santos emerged from the lead truck, a compact woman in her 50s with calloused hands and eyes that missed nothing. She walked the property with the focused attention of someone who understood that Alaska didn't forgive poor planning or shoddy workmanship. "You picked a hell of a place to build a business," she said, studying the elevation reports I'd commissioned. "But I'll give you this. The location's perfect for what you're planning. Total privacy, world-class views, and close enough to town that you won't go completely feral." We spent the morning walking through the cabin, discussing load-bearing walls and plumbing upgrades, and the kind of insulation that would keep guests comfortable when outside temperatures dropped below survival. Maria's team measured and photographed and made notes in the efficient shorthand of people who built things that lasted. "Timeline's tight if you want to open next summer," she said, as we stood on the porch, looking out at the lake, where ice was already forming along the edges. "We're talking about adding 4 guest suites, upgrading the electrical and plumbing systems, building a commercial-grade kitchen, and constructing a separate spa building. That's a lot of work in a short window. Can it be done? Can be done, yeah. Question is whether you want to pay what it'll cost to do it right." I thought about the account statements I'd reviewed that morning, the careful investments that had grown steadily while Tom made jokes about my PIN money, the inheritance from parents who'd believed in education and self-sufficiency, who'd worked 2 jobs each to send me to college, who'd trusted me to make something meaningful of the opportunities they'd provided. Money isn't the limiting factor. Quality is, Maria smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. "In that case, we can absolutely do this, but you're going to have to make some decisions about living arrangements. This place is going to be a construction zone for the next 8 months. I'd been thinking about this problem since my first night in the cabin. Staying would mean months of noise, dust, and constant disruption. Leaving would mean returning to Kansas, probably triggering exactly the kind of intervention Tom was threatening. What if I built something temporary? A small cabin where I could stay during construction. Could work. Keep you close enough to make decisions, but far enough away to maintain some sanity. Maria pulled out her tablet, sketching quickly. We could put up a kit cabin down by the lake. Nothing fancy, but warm and functional. Tear it down when the main project's finished, or keep it as staff quarters. How long would that take to build? 2 weeks, maybe 3. We'd need to pour a foundation and run utilities, but it's straightforward work. I looked at the spot she'd indicated. A level area about 100 yards from the main cabin, with an unobstructed view of the water. Private enough for solitude, close enough for supervision. Perfect for a woman learning to live entirely on her own terms. Let's do it. That afternoon, while Maria's crew began laying out foundation markers, I drove into town for supplies. Fairmont Station, population 847, according to the welcome sign, consisted of a grocery store, hardware store, gas station, and a combination cafe bar called the Northern Light that appeared to serve as the community's unofficial city hall. The grocery store clerk, a woman named Betty with kind eyes and practical gray hair, helped me navigate the complexities of shopping for an extended stay in rural Alaska. "You're the one bought the Morrison place," she said, not quite making it a question. Word travels fast. Honey, in a town this size, stranger buying property is front-page news, especially when she shows up alone and starts talking about building a resort. I paused in loading canned goods into my cart. Is that a problem? Betty considered this, studying my face with the careful attention of someone who'd lived through enough winters to recognize genuine determination. Depends what kind of resort you're planning. We've seen folks come through wanting to build casinos or strip malls or turn the whole place into some kind of theme park. Nothing like that. I want to create a place where people can experience real Alaska, the wilderness, the culture, the sense of possibility, something that supports the community rather than exploiting it. And you think you can do that? Coming from... She glanced at my Kansas license plate visible through the window. Coming from somewhere flat and easy? It was a fair question. I thought about my 35 years of managing complexity, resolving conflicts, and creating experiences that brought out the best in people. About the fundraisers I'd organized that had fed families and funded scholarships and built community centers. About the dinner parties where I'd helped strangers become friends, where I'd negotiated business deals disguised as social conversations, where I'd turned my home into a space that made people feel valued and heard. I think I can learn, and I think I can listen to people who know more than I do. Betty nodded slowly, then reached under the counter and pulled out a business card. My daughter runs the best guiding service in the area. If you're serious about this resort idea, you'll need local partners who understand what tourists want and what the land can handle. I took the card, reading the name, Arctic Adventures, Jenny Morrison, owner. Any relation to the man who sold me the property? His daughter. She grew up on your land, knows every trail and fishing spot for 50 miles. Smart girl, good business sense, but she's been struggling since her dad moved south. Tourists usually book through the big companies in Anchorage. Don't know there's local expertise available. That evening, I called Jenny Morrison from my temporary quarters while construction noise echoed from the main cabin. She agreed to meet the next morning, her voice carrying the cautious optimism of someone who'd learned not to expect too much but hadn't given up hoping. She arrived at sunrise, driving a pickup truck that had seen hard use but careful maintenance. Jenny was about Sarah's age, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of deep water. She moved through the wilderness like it was her living room, pointing out wildlife signs and explaining the seasonal patterns that would affect any tourism operation. Dad always said this property had resort potential, she said, as we walked the shoreline. Perfect access to fishing, hiking, wildlife viewing. But it would need to be done right. Small scale, respectful, focused on the experience rather than just extracting money from tourists. That's exactly what I have in mind. We spent the morning discussing partnerships, profit sharing, and the kind of authentic experiences that would justify premium pricing. Jenny knew where to find the best fishing, which trails offered the most spectacular views, how to track and photograph wildlife without disturbing natural behaviors. I have one condition, she said as we walked back toward the cabin. Any business we build here, it supports the community. Local hiring, local suppliers, local culture. Too many outside developers come in and turn Alaska into a theme park version of itself. Agreed. I want to create something that belongs here, not something that could exist anywhere. Jenny studied my face, looking for the kind of insincerity she'd probably encountered from other outsiders with big dreams and small understanding. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. All right then, let's build something worth building. As she drove away, I stood on my porch watching the sun paint the lake in shades of gold and copper. My phone had been buzzing with ignored calls all morning. Tom's number, the children's numbers, even Dr. Harrison's office. But I'd also received emails from my investment advisor confirming that my portfolio had grown by another 8% this quarter, from the contractor confirming that construction was ahead of schedule, from the Small Business Administration approving my application for additional funding. Dead weight didn't receive approval for business loans. Dead weight didn't negotiate partnerships with local experts. Dead weight didn't stand on her own porch, watching her dreams take shape in the wilderness she'd claimed as her own. I was beginning to understand what the writer who'd lived here for 15 years had discovered. Sometimes you had to travel to the edge of the world to find the center of yourself. The loons called across the water, their voices carrying promises I was finally ready to believe. Winter arrived like a judgment, swift and absolute and more beautiful than anything I'd experienced in 6 decades of Kansas seasons. By February, the lake was a white highway stretching toward mountains that seemed carved from crystal, and my temporary cabin had become a cocoon of warmth in a world transformed by silence. The main construction had slowed but never stopped, Maria's crew working in shifts through the harsh weather with the kind of determination that seemed uniquely Alaskan. Inside the temporary cabin, I spent the dark months planning, researching, and learning the hospitality business with the focused intensity of someone making up for lost time. Jenny stopped by twice a week, bringing groceries and mail and the kind of practical wisdom that only came from surviving 40 winters in the bush. She'd become something I'd never had in Kansas, a true friend who valued my mind rather than my domestic services. "Package from Kansas," she said one bitter February afternoon, stamping snow off her boots as she entered my small kitchen. The box was substantial, professionally packed, with Tom's law office return address. I'd been expecting this. Inside, beneath layers of legal padding, were divorce papers. Not the simple dissolution I'd filed through my own attorney in Anchorage, but a complex document filled with accusations and demands. Tom was contesting everything: my competency to make financial decisions, my right to community property, even my legal residence in Alaska. Attached was a letter in his familiar handwriting. "Maggie, this foolishness has gone on long enough. I've spoken to medical professionals who confirm that your behavior indicates possible early-stage dementia or a serious psychological break. No rational person abandons their family and life savings to play pioneer in the wilderness. I'm prepared to file for guardianship if you don't return immediately and submit to proper medical evaluation. The children support this decision. We're worried about you." Jenny watched me read, her expression darkening as she absorbed my body language. "Bad news? My husband wants to have me declared mentally incompetent." She whistled low. "On what grounds?" "Apparently buying property in Alaska and starting a business constitutes evidence of dementia." "Well, hell. Half the state would be in asylums if that were true." Jenny poured herself coffee without asking. Another thing I loved about our friendship. "What are you going to do?" I thought about the question while watching snow fall outside my windows like a blessing. In Kansas, this moment would have triggered panic, phone calls to lawyers, desperate attempts to prove my sanity to people who'd already decided I'd lost it. The old Maggie would have rushed home to make peace, to smooth over conflict, to resume the smaller version of herself that everyone found so much more comfortable. But the woman who'd lived through an Alaskan winter, who'd negotiated construction contracts and built partnerships and learned to split firewood when the generator failed, had different responses available. I'm going to prove him wrong. How? I pulled out the folder I'd been preparing for months, documentation that would make Tom's accusations look not just false, but ridiculous. Bank statements showing my assets had grown substantially under my own management. Business plans that demonstrated strategic thinking and market analysis. Letters from contractors, suppliers, and partners attesting to my competency and professionalism. He thinks I'm hiding in the woods making emotional decisions, I said, spreading the documents across my kitchen table. Instead, I've been building something that will be worth millions when it opens. Jenny studied the papers with the careful attention of someone who understood business. Her guiding service had survived and grown through careful planning and sound judgment, and she recognized the same qualities in my work. "This is solid," she said finally. "Really solid. You've thought through everything. Environmental impact, staffing, marketing, seasonal variations. This isn't the work of someone who's lost her mind." "No, it isn't. But fighting this kind of thing costs money and energy. You sure you want to get dragged into a legal battle instead of focusing on the business?" I thought about Tom's letter, about his assumption that threatening me with medical evaluation and guardianship would send me scurrying home in fear. About 35 years of backing down from conflicts, apologizing for inconveniencing people with my existence, making myself smaller to accommodate everyone else's comfort. "Jenny, I've been avoiding conflict my whole life. It never made anything better, just postponed the reckoning. If Tom wants a legal fight, he can have one. But he's about to discover that the woman he married isn't the woman he's trying to control." That afternoon, I drove into town through snow that fell like determination, meeting with the lawyer I'd retained when I'd first arrived in Alaska. Rebecca Martinez was Jenny's age, but with the sharp focus of someone who'd built her practice defending people others underestimated. Natives fighting for land rights, women escaping abusive situations, elderly residents protecting their assets from predatory relatives. "This guardianship thread is interesting," she said, reviewing Tom's paperwork in her small but efficient office. "Your husband's lawyer is claiming you've abandoned your family and are making irrational financial decisions, but the evidence suggests exactly the opposite." "What do you mean?" "Margaret, you've increased your net worth by 40% in 8 months. You've started a business with excellent profit potential. You've integrated into a new community and established professional relationships. These aren't the actions of someone with diminished capacity. They're the actions of someone who's finally operating at full capacity." She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the analytical gaze of someone who'd seen every variation of family financial warfare. "I think your husband made a miscalculation. He assumed you were having a breakdown, acting impulsively, making decisions you'd regret when you came to your senses. Instead, you've been systematically building a new life that works better than your old one." "So what happens next?" "Next, we document everything. Your business success, your community integration, your financial growth, your mental acuity. We build a case that demonstrates not only that you're competent, but that you're more competent than the man trying to control you." "And then?" Rebecca smiled, the expression of a lawyer who'd found the perfect strategy for her client's situation. "Then we file a countersuit. Harassment, defamation, interference with business relationships. We make it clear that any attempt to challenge your competency will result in very public documentation of why your marriage ended and who's really making irrational decisions." I thought about this nuclear option, about the public exposure it would bring to Tom's treatment of me, about the satisfaction of finally fighting back with weapons that matched his. How long would all this take? Months? Maybe a year? Legal battles are expensive and exhausting, and there's always the risk that a judge might be sympathetic to a worried husband's claims about his elderly wife. But there's another option? There's always another option. You could prove your competency so thoroughly that his case becomes laughable before it ever reaches court. How? Rebecca pulled out a legal pad and began writing. You could open your business ahead of schedule, generate revenue, create jobs, attract national attention. Make it impossible for anyone to claim you're making poor decisions by demonstrating the spectacular success of those decisions. The resort won't be ready until summer. The resort won't be ready. But what about a smaller operation? A few guest rooms, some guided tours, a preview of what's coming. Enough to establish that this isn't a fantasy. It's a functioning business. I thought about the main cabin, still under construction, but nearly habitable. About Jenny's expertise in guiding and my experience in hospitality. About the possibility of proving Tom wrong, not with legal arguments, but with undeniable reality. We could do a soft opening. Limited guests, premium pricing, exclusive access, market it as a preview of Alaska's newest luxury wilderness experience. Exactly. Nothing defeats claims of incompetency like documented business success. That night, I called Jenny from my temporary cabin while Aurora Borealis painted the sky in ribbons of green and gold. How quickly could we put together a guiding operation for small groups? How small? 4 guests maximum. High-end clientele willing to pay premium prices for authentic experiences. Give me 2 weeks to line up equipment and permits. But Margaret, are you sure about this? Opening early means everything has to be perfect from day one. No room for mistakes. I looked out at the wilderness that had become my home, at the business that was becoming my legacy, at the life I'd built from nothing but determination and the courage to finally bet on myself. Jenny, I've been making other people's lives perfect for 35 years. It's time to make my own life perfect. All right then, let's give them something to remember. The aurora danced overhead like applause, and I began planning my resurrection. The first guests arrived on a morning in late April, when the lake ice was singing, that haunting melody of frozen water beginning to surrender to spring. I watched from the main cabin's new picture windows as Jenny guided their helicopter to a landing on the beach, my heart hammering with the kind of anxiety I hadn't felt since my first dinner party as a young wife. But this was different. This time, success or failure belonged entirely to me. "Margaret, they're here!" Jenny called, her voice carrying excitement that matched my terror. Our first paying customers, a tech executive from Seattle and his wife, celebrating their 30th anniversary with what their booking agent had described as the ultimate Alaska experience. I smoothed my hands down the front of my jacket, new Alaska gear that actually fit, unlike the decades of clothes I'd chosen to accommodate Tom's preferences, and walked out to greet them. David and Patricia Kimura emerged from the helicopter like visitors from another world, expensive outdoor gear still creased from the store, faces bright with anticipation and the kind of nervous energy that came with paying $5,000 for 3 days in the wilderness. "Welcome to Northern Lights Sanctuary," I said, extending my hand with confidence I was still learning to feel. "I'm Margaret Walsh, your host." "This is incredible," Patricia breathed, turning in a slow circle to take in the mountains, the lake, the lodge that had risen from Maria's crew's determination, and my stubborn vision. "The pictures don't do it justice." David was already pulling out his camera, capturing the kind of views that would make their friends back in Seattle question their own vacation choices. "How long have you been operating here?" "This is actually our inaugural weekend," I said, deciding honesty was better than pretense. "You're our very first guests." Instead of concern, their faces lit with genuine delight. "We're pioneers," Patricia laughed. "David, we're literally the first people to stay here. That's even better than we hoped." I led them into the main lodge, watching their reactions as they absorbed the space we'd created. The great room soared 2 stories, with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the wilderness into living artwork. The fireplace was already crackling, Jenny's work, and the scent of my grandmother's cinnamon bread recipe filled the air from the kitchen where I'd been baking since dawn. "This is spectacular," David said, running his hand along the custom dining table Maria's team had crafted from reclaimed local timber. "But it doesn't feel touristy. It feels authentic. Authentic. The word I'd been chasing for months. The quality that would separate our retreat from the countless commercial lodges that treated Alaska like a theme park. That was exactly our goal, I said, leading them to their suite, one of 4 guest rooms we'd completed ahead of schedule. We wanted to create a space that honored the wilderness while providing genuine luxury. The suite was perfect, if I allowed myself that moment of pride. Local artwork, handcrafted furniture, a bathroom with a soaking tub, positioned to frame the lake view. Tom would have called it showing off, but Patricia clasped her hands together like she'd discovered treasure. "This is our dream room," she said to David. "Honey, take a picture of me by that window." While they settled in, I returned to the kitchen where Jenny was preparing for our afternoon excursion, a guided tour of the lake and surrounding wilderness that would showcase why people traveled thousands of miles for this experience. "They love it," I told her, pulling the last batch of bread from the oven. "They actually love it." "Course they do. You built something amazing here." Jenny paused in organizing her gear. "But Margaret, you know this is just the beginning, right? One successful weekend doesn't solve your legal problems." She was right, of course. Tom's lawyers were still threatening guardianship proceedings, still claiming my Alaska adventure was evidence of mental instability. But each day that passed without me crawling home in defeat made their case weaker and my position stronger. "It's not just about the legal battle," I said, arranging fresh flowers in the vase on the kitchen island, another detail that transformed a commercial space into something personal. "It's about proving to myself that I can do this, that the woman who managed family chaos for 35 years can manage something this complex. You're managing it beautifully. The afternoon tour was everything I'd imagined and more. Jenny guided us across the lake in her custom boat, explaining the ecosystem while I served fresh coffee and homemade cookies from thermoses, designed to keep everything perfect despite the wind and spray. We spotted eagles, moose, and a family of beavers that posed like professional models for David's increasingly expensive camera equipment. I've stayed at resorts all over the world, Patricia told me as we drifted in a quiet cove where the only sounds were lapping water and bird calls. But I've never felt this connected to a place. It's like being inside a nature documentary, except real. That's exactly what we hoped you'd experience. How did you know to come here? David asked. This seems like such an unlikely place for someone to start a business. I considered how to answer, looking out at the wilderness that had become my salvation. How to explain that sometimes you had to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you actually needed. I spent 35 years making everyone else comfortable, I said finally. I came here to find out what it felt like to make myself comfortable. That evening, I served dinner at the handcrafted table while firelight danced across the great room's log walls. Fresh salmon. Jenny had caught that morning, vegetables from the greenhouse we'd rushed to complete, wild berry compote I'd made from fruit I'd learned to identify through trial and error. This is restaurant quality, David said, and I felt the glow of recognition that had nothing to do with pleasing anyone but myself. Where did you learn to cook like this? Patricia asked. 40 years of practice, I laughed, though I'm finally cooking for people who appreciate it instead of just expecting it. After dinner, we sat by the fire while northern lights painted the sky in ribbons of green and gold. David and Patricia shared stories of their 3 decades together, the compromises and growth and renegotiations that had kept their marriage strong. The key, Patricia said, her hand finding David's across the space between their chairs, is remembering that you're both allowed to change. The person you married at 25 isn't the person you're married to at 55. You have to keep choosing each other as you become who you're meant to be. I thought about Tom, about his inability to see me as anything other than the young woman he'd married, about his panic when I'd finally outgrown the role he'd assigned me. Some people grew together, others grew apart. The tragedy wasn't the growing, it was the refusal to acknowledge it. Margaret, David said, as the evening wound down, I have to ask, how did you end up here? This place, this business, it's clearly a massive undertaking for someone starting over. I looked at my first guests, these kind people who'd trusted their anniversary celebration to my untested vision, and decided they deserved the truth. My husband called me deadweight at a family dinner. Everyone laughed, so I left everything behind and came here to find out if I was actually dead weight, or if I was just a woman who'd been carrying everyone else for so long I'd forgotten how to carry myself. Patricia's hand went to her heart. Oh, Margaret, and what did you find out? David asked quietly. I looked around the great room we'd built from nothing, at the business that was already booking guests for the summer season, at the life I'd created entirely through my own vision and determination. I found out that some people mistake service for weakness, and some people mistake independence for insanity. And some people, Patricia said, raising her wine glass in a toast, build something so beautiful that everyone else realizes what they lost. We drank to new beginnings and second chances, while outside my windows, the wilderness I'd claimed as my own stretched toward horizons that held nothing but possibility. Tom's lawyers could threaten all they wanted. I had guests to serve, a business to run, and a life to live that finally belonged entirely to me. Dead weight didn't build sanctuaries. Dead weight didn't create experiences that made people weep with joy. Dead weight didn't stand in the great room of her own lodge, surrounded by the evidence of her competence, planning tomorrow's adventure for people who'd traveled across the continent to share her dream. I was many things now: entrepreneur, host, wilderness woman. But dead weight had never been less accurate. Tom was about to learn the difference between a woman who'd been held down and a woman who'd been set free. The article in Travel Plus Leisure changed everything. I was reading it on my laptop in the lodge's great room 3 weeks after David and Patricia's visit, watching morning light dance across the lake while my coffee grew cold in the mug Patricia had insisted on buying from our small gift collection. Alaska's best-kept secret. Northern Lights, Sanctuary redefines wilderness luxury. The headline alone made my heart race, but it was the opening paragraph that truly stole my breath. In an era of manufactured experiences and Instagram-ready backdrops, Northern Lights Sanctuary offers something increasingly rare: authentic transformation. Host Margaret Walsh has created more than a wilderness retreat. She's crafted a space where guests don't just visit Alaska, they discover parts of themselves they didn't know existed. The article included David's photographs, professional quality images that captured not just the stunning landscape, but the feeling of being here. The aurora dancing over our lake, the great room at sunset, firelight warming log walls. Patricia and me laughing together in the kitchen, looking like women who'd found exactly where they belonged. My phone started ringing before I'd finished reading. "Margaret, this is Jennifer Chen from the Alaska Tourism Board," the first caller said, her excitement crackling through the connection. "We'd like to discuss featuring Northern Lights Sanctuary in our luxury campaign for next season. This article is generating exactly the kind of interest we want for authentic Alaska experiences." The calls continued throughout the morning. Travel agents wanting to book clients, a documentary crew interested in filming, a publisher asking if I'd consider writing about the experience of starting over at 64. By noon, I had 37 booking inquiries and a waiting list that stretched into the following year. Jenny arrived during the lunch rush of phone calls, her expression cycling between amazement and concern. "You've seen the article?" "I've seen it." "I've also seen my email inbox crash twice from the volume of inquiries." "Margaret, this is incredible. But are you ready for this level of attention? Once word gets out about your success..." She didn't need to finish the thought. Success this visible would make it impossible for Tom to maintain his narrative about my mental instability. But it would also make it impossible for me to remain quietly hidden in the Alaska wilderness, rebuilding my life away from the judgment of people who'd never believed in my capabilities. "There's something else," Jenny said, pulling out her phone. "Local news wants to do a feature story, but they're asking questions about your background, about why someone from Kansas suddenly appeared in Alaska and built a luxury resort." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, not anxiety about the attention itself, but about the story it would tell. The woman who'd run away from her family to play pioneer in the wilderness, the wife who'd abandoned her responsibilities to chase selfish dreams, the narrative Tom and his lawyers would use to support their competency claims. What kind of questions? The reporter, nice woman named Sarah Kim, she wants to know about your hospitality background, your business experience, how you financed this operation. She's not trying to be invasive, just wants to understand how someone creates something this successful, seemingly overnight. I walked to the great room windows, looking out at the wilderness that had become my sanctuary. The afternoon sun painted the lake gold, and somewhere in the distance I could see eagles circling over their fishing grounds. This place had taught me that running towards something you valued was different from running away from something that diminished you. "Set up the interview," I said. "It's time to tell the real story." Sarah Kim arrived the next morning, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s with the kind of practical intelligence that came from years of separating fact from fiction. We sat in the great room with coffee and fresh blueberry muffins while she set up her recording equipment, her professional demeanor softening as she absorbed the space we'd created. "This is remarkable," she said, gesturing toward the handcrafted details that made the lodge feel like a home rather than a hotel. "But I have to ask, how does someone go from being a housewife in Kansas to running a luxury wilderness retreat in Alaska? That's quite a transformation." I'd been preparing for this question since Jenny's call, thinking about how to frame the story in a way that honored the truth without feeding the narrative my former family was constructing about my supposed breakdown. I spent 35 years managing complex logistics, resolving conflicts, creating experiences that brought people together, and building relationships that lasted decades, I began. I just did it under the title of housewife instead of hospitality manager. "You're saying your marriage was preparation for this business?" "I'm saying that managing a household, organizing events, coordinating schedules, and making people feel valued and comfortable are exactly the skills needed to run a successful hospitality operation. The only difference is that now I'm being compensated for work I've always done." Sarah made notes, her expression thoughtful. "But the financial investment required to create something like this, that's substantial even for someone with business experience." This was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The moment where I'd have to reveal that the dead-weight wife had been financially independent all along. My parents believed in education and self-sufficiency, I said carefully. They left me an inheritance that I invested carefully over 20 years. When I decided to make this change, I had the resources to do it properly. So this wasn't an impulsive decision? I spent 6 months researching the Alaska hospitality market before I bought the property. Another 8 months planning the renovation and building partnerships with local suppliers. Everything you see here was carefully planned and strategically executed. Sarah looked around the great room again, taking in the evidence of systematic planning and professional execution. Margaret, I have to ask, there are rumors that your family has raised concerns about this venture, that they've questioned your decision-making capacity. How do you respond to that? I felt the moment crystallize around us, the interview becoming something larger than a puff piece about a successful new business. This was my opportunity to shape the narrative, to define myself before others defined me. Sarah, let me ask you something. If a 64-year-old man left his job to start a business that became successful enough to be featured in national magazines within 6 months, would anyone question his mental capacity? Probably not. The difference between confidence and instability often depends on whether you're expected to remain small and accommodating or encouraged to grow and succeed. I chose growth. And your family? I thought about Tom's increasingly desperate phone calls, about the children who'd sided with him without ever asking for my side of the story, about 35 years of being taken for granted by people who couldn't imagine me as anything other than their personal support system. My family loved the woman who made their lives easier. They're having difficulty accepting the woman who makes her own life meaningful. That afternoon, after Sarah had finished photographing the lodge and the grounds, I received a call that made my hands shake as I answered. Mrs. Walsh, this is Rebecca Martinez. We have a problem. What kind of problem? Your husband's lawyers have escalated. They're filing for emergency guardianship, claiming that the magazine article proves you're in a manic episode, making grandiose claims about business success while living in delusion. I sank into one of the great room chairs, looking out at the wilderness that had become my home, at the business that proved my competence, at the life that demonstrated my capacity for sound judgment. They're using my success as evidence of my incompetence? They're arguing that no rational person your age would abandon their family to start a wilderness resort, that the publicity you're generating is evidence of manic behavior, and that someone needs to protect you from yourself before you lose everything. When? The hearing is scheduled for next month. Margaret, they're asking for immediate conservatorship of your assets pending a competency evaluation. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the battle I'd been avoiding settle around my shoulders. Tom wasn't just threatened by my independence. He was terrified that my success would expose his own limitations, his inability to see value in anything he couldn't control. Rebecca, I want you to file a countersuit, harassment, defamation, and attempted financial exploitation of a competent adult. And I want to demand that the hearing be held here in Alaska, where my business and life are established. Margaret, are you sure? A legal battle like this will be public, expensive, and exhausting. I looked around the great room where Patricia had toasted new beginnings, where Sarah had recorded the story of a woman who'd refused to stay small, where guests would soon gather around fires that warmed both bodies and spirits. I'm sure. Tom wants to prove I'm incompetent? I'll prove that a woman who builds something this successful from scratch is anything but incompetent. And if we lose? I thought about David's question, what I'd discovered about myself in the wilderness, and about Patricia's observation that the key to any relationship was allowing people to become who they were meant to be. We won't lose, because the evidence of my competence is all around us, generating revenue and changing lives and proving that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is bet everything on yourself. Outside my windows, eagles circled over water that reflected nothing but possibility. The battle was coming, but I was ready for it. After all, I'd been preparing my whole life to defend the woman I'd finally become. The courtroom in Anchorage was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and efficient, with windows that looked out toward the mountains I'd learned to call home. Tom sat at the plaintiff's table with his team of lawyers, wearing the navy suit he'd always claimed made him look authoritative. He hadn't looked at me once since I'd entered with Rebecca at my side. But I'd looked at him, studying the man I'd been married to for 35 years as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The expensive suit couldn't hide the way his shoulders had curved inward, or the lines of worry that had etched themselves around his eyes. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with the kind of bitterness that came from discovering your control had been an illusion. "Your Honor," Tom's lead attorney was saying, a sharp-faced man named Harrison who specialized in elder law and family conservatorship. "We're here today because a 64-year-old woman has abandoned her family, liquidated substantial assets, and relocated to the wilderness of Alaska based on what can only be described as grandiose delusions." I felt Rebecca's hand briefly touch mine under the table, a reminder to stay calm, to let our evidence speak rather than react to the accusations. We'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering documentation that would make their claims seem not just false, but absurd. "Mrs. Walsh," Harrison continued, "left her home of 30 years, following what her family describes as an increasingly erratic pattern of behavior. She purchased property sight unseen, began construction on a commercial enterprise with no relevant experience, and has since made claims about her business success that border on the fantastic." He gestured toward a folder thick with papers. "We have testimony from family members documenting Mrs. Walsh's increasing isolation, poor financial judgment, and apparent inability to maintain normal family relationships. Her own children have expressed concern about her mental state and her capacity to manage significant assets." Judge Patricia Hendricks, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every variation of family financial drama, studied the papers before her. "Mr. Harrison, what specific evidence do you have of financial mismanagement or diminished capacity?" "Your Honor, Mrs. Walsh spent nearly $400,000 on remote Alaska property and then invested an additional $2 million in construction and business development, all without consulting her family or seeking professional advice. And this investment has yielded what result?" Harrison's pause was barely perceptible, but I caught it. This was the question they'd been hoping to avoid. The business is still in its early stages, Your Honor, but our concern is that Mrs. Walsh has put her entire financial security at risk based on unrealistic expectations about— "Mr. Harrison," Judge Hendricks interrupted, "is the business profitable?" Another pause. "We believe the reported profits are exaggerated." Rebecca stood, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of professional satisfaction. "Your Honor, if I may present evidence that directly addresses Mr. Harrison's claims?" For the next hour, Rebecca systematically dismantled every argument Tom's lawyers had constructed. Bank statements showing my business had generated over $300,000 in revenue in just 4 months of operation. Booking records demonstrating we were sold out through the following year. Letters from the Alaska Tourism Board, travel industry professionals, and satisfied customers attesting to both the quality of our operation and my professional competence. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Rebecca said, pulling out her final folder, "we have documentation that Mr. Walsh and his family have a significant financial interest in declaring Mrs. Walsh incompetent. Upon her death or incapacitation, they stand to inherit assets currently valued at approximately $6 million. The courtroom fell silent, except for the scratch of the court reporter's machine and the distant sound of Anchorage traffic. Tom's face had gone pale, and I saw his lawyers exchanging glances that suggested this particular piece of evidence was unwelcome news. "Mrs. Walsh," Judge Hendricks said, addressing me directly for the first time, "I'd like to hear from you. In your own words, please explain your decision to relocate to Alaska and start this business." I stood slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The laughter at my family's table, the decision to drive north toward something unknown, the months of construction and planning, and the slow, careful building of a life that belonged entirely to me. Your Honor, I spent 35 years managing complex operations under the title of housewife. I coordinated schedules, managed budgets, resolved conflicts, and created experiences that brought people together. I raised 3 children, supported my husband's career, and saved enough money to be financially independent, all while being told that my contributions were less valuable than his because they didn't come with a paycheck. I looked directly at Tom for the first time since entering the courtroom. When I suggested using some of our assets to start a business that would utilize my skills and education, my husband called me dead weight. My children laughed, At that moment, I realized I had a choice. I could continue to accept their assessment of my worth, or I could prove it wrong. And you chose to prove it wrong by moving to Alaska. I chose to prove it wrong by building something meaningful with my own hands, my own mind, and my own money. The fact that I chose to do it in Alaska rather than Vermont or Colorado or anywhere else is irrelevant to the question of my competence. Judge Hendricks made notes, then looked up at me with something that might have been approval. Mrs. Walsh, do you have any regrets about your decision? I thought about the question carefully, considering not just the legal implications, but the human ones. The family dinners I'd never share, the grandchildren I might never know, the life I'd left behind in pursuit of one that fit better. I regret that it took me 64 years to value myself enough to make this choice. I regret that my family preferred a version of me that was small enough for their comfort rather than large enough for my own fulfillment. But I don't regret building something that proves what I've always known about myself, that I'm capable of extraordinary things when I'm finally allowed to attempt them. The courtroom was quiet for a long moment. Then Judge Hendricks spoke, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades separating truth from manipulation. Mr. Harrison, your petition is denied. Mrs. Walsh has demonstrated not diminished capacity, but expanded capability. The evidence shows a woman who has successfully translated a lifetime of management skills into a profitable business enterprise. That some family members disapprove of her choices does not constitute grounds for guardianship. She turned to Tom's table, her expression stern. Furthermore, I'm concerned about what appears to be an attempt to use the court system to control a competent adult's financial decisions for the benefit of potential inheritors. Mrs. Walsh, you are free to manage your assets and your life as you see fit. After the gavel fell and the courtroom began to clear, I stood in the hallway outside, feeling strangely empty despite the victory. Tom approached slowly, his lawyers hanging back at a respectful distance. Maggie, he said quietly, and I heard something in his voice I'd never heard before. Genuine defeat. It's Margaret now. Margaret. He looked older than his 67 years, worn down by months of legal battles and the gradual realization that the woman he'd taken for granted was never coming back. I want you to know, I never meant for it to go this far. What did you mean? I meant for you to come home. I thought if I made it difficult enough, expensive enough, you'd realize this whole thing was a mistake and come back where you belonged. I looked at this man who'd shared my bed for 3 decades, who'd fathered my children, who'd somehow convinced himself that love meant keeping people small enough to control. Tom, I finally am where I belong. I'm sorry that doesn't include you. He nodded slowly, perhaps understanding for the first time that some departures were permanent, some growth irreversible. The kids want to see you, Sarah especially. She's been asking questions about how we treated you, about what we might have missed. They know where to find me. I walked away from the courthouse, from the legal battle, from the last threads connecting me to a life that had never quite fit. Rebecca drove me to the airport, where Jenny waited with a chartered plane that would carry me home to my lake, my business, my carefully constructed sanctuary in the wilderness. As we flew north toward Fairmont Station, I watched the landscape change from urban sprawl to endless forest, from the complicated patterns of civilization to the clean simplicity of wilderness. Judge Hendricks had been wrong about one thing. I didn't have expanded capability. I'd always had this capability. I'd just finally found a place where it was valued instead of feared. The plane banked toward home, and I began planning my next expansion. Dead weight didn't win court cases. Dead weight didn't build businesses that changed people's lives. But a woman who'd been carrying everyone else for 35 years could certainly carry herself toward any horizon she chose. 2 years after the court hearing, I stood on the main lodge's deck watching a helicopter land on our private helipad, the latest addition to a property that now sprawled across 200 acres and employed 37 people year-round. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the mountains across the lake wore crowns of fresh snow that would soon transform the world into the crystalline wonderland our winter guests paid premium prices to experience. The helicopter's passengers emerged with the careful movements of people stepping into a place they'd only dreamed about. A tech CEO from Silicon Valley and her family, celebrating her 50th birthday with what their booking agent had described as the ultimate digital detox experience. They would spend 5 days here, learning to fly fish with Jenny, participating in wildlife photography workshops, and discovering what silence sounded like when it wasn't interrupted by notifications. But it was the second helicopter that made my heart skip. Sarah emerged first, looking around with the wide-eyed wonder of someone seeing her mother's world for the first time. Behind her came Michael, then David, my 3 children, finally accepting my invitation to visit the life they'd once dismissed as evidence of mental breakdown. "Mom," Sarah said, and there was something different in her voice. Not the casual dismissal I remembered from our last family dinner, but genuine awe mixed with what might have been regret. This is incredible." She was right. Northern Lights Sanctuary had grown into something that exceeded even my most ambitious dreams. The main lodge now featured 12 luxury suites, each one designed to showcase a different aspect of Alaska's natural beauty. The spa building offered treatments that incorporated local traditions and ingredients, while the conference center attracted executive retreats from Fortune 500 companies seeking authentic team-building experiences. "Welcome to my home," I said, embracing each of my children in turn. Sarah held on longer than necessary, as if trying to memorize something she'd lost and was only now realizing she needed. I gave them the full tour, watching their expressions change as they absorbed what their mother had built. The commercial kitchen where I still prepared signature dishes for special occasions. The library stocked with first editions and local history that made our guests' evenings as rich as their days. The workshop spaces where visiting artists taught traditional crafts alongside modern techniques. "You did all this?" David asked, as we stood in the conference room where Fortune 500 executives plotted strategy while looking out at wilderness that had never heard a honking car horn. "I mean, you planned it, managed it, built it?" "I had help," I said, thinking of Jenny and Maria and the dozens of local craftspeople whose skills had turned my vision into reality. "But yes, I did all this." Michael was studying the financial charts displayed in the business center. Visitor numbers, revenue projections, employment statistics that showed how our success had rippled through the entire region. "Mom, these numbers, this isn't a hobby. This is a major hospitality operation. You're employing half the county, 43% actually. We'll be at 51% when the winter expansion is complete." They were quiet during dinner, picking at the salmon Jenny had caught that morning and the vegetables from our greenhouse while trying to reconcile the woman before them with the mother they thought they'd known. Outside the dining room windows, Aurora Borealis painted the sky in ribbons of green and gold, the same lights I'd learned to read like weather forecasts. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said finally, setting down her fork and looking directly at me for the first time since arriving. "We all do. You don't owe me anything. We do." Her voice was steady, but I could see tears forming. "I've been thinking about that Thanksgiving dinner, about how we laughed when Dad called you, when he said what he said. I've been thinking about how we never asked what you wanted, what you dreamed about, what made you happy." "Sarah, let me finish. I've spent 2 years telling people my mom had some kind of breakdown and ran away to Alaska. But looking at this place, seeing what you've accomplished, you didn't have a breakdown, Mom. You had a breakthrough." David nodded, his face serious in the firelight. "I've been researching the hospitality industry since we decided to visit. Do you know what the failure rate is for new luxury resorts, especially ones started by people with no previous commercial experience? I imagine it's high. 87% fail within the first 2 years. But you're not just succeeding, you're setting industry standards. I read the article in Hospitality Design about your sustainable practices, the piece in Forbes about transforming rural economies through authentic tourism. Mom, you're being studied in business schools." I thought about the professor from Stanford who'd called last month, asking if she could bring a group of graduate students to study our operational model. About the documentary crew that had spent 3 weeks filming our sustainable practices. About the invitation to speak at the International Hospitality Conference in Dubai. "It's been a learning experience," I said simply. "Learning experience?" Michael laughed, but there was no cruelty in it, just amazement. "Mom, you revolutionized an industry. While we were worried about you losing your mind in the wilderness, you were building an empire." Empire. The word felt strange applied to what had begun as simple survival, the need to prove I was more than the sum of other people's limitations. But looking around the dining room where guests from 6 different countries were sharing stories and planning tomorrow's adventures, I supposed it was accurate. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice dropping to something more personal. About Dad. I waited, watching my daughter struggle with words that had clearly been rehearsing for months. He's been different since the court case, smaller somehow. Jennifer left him last year. She said living with him was like being married to a man who was angry at the world for changing without his permission. I felt a pang of something that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't satisfaction either. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Really? I considered the question while watching the aurora dance outside our windows. Was I sorry that the man who'd called me dead weight was struggling to rebuild his life without the infrastructure I'd provided for 35 years? Was I sorry that his children were finally seeing him clearly enough to make their own judgments about his character? I'm sorry that he's learning painful lessons about the value of what he took for granted. I'm sorry that it took losing me for him to understand what he'd lost. But Sarah, I'm not sorry I left. I'm not sorry I built this. And I'm not sorry I proved that everything he said about me was wrong. He knows that now, Michael said quietly. He won't admit it, but he knows. He asks about you sometimes. Not like he wants you back, but like he's trying to understand how he got it so wrong. We talked until the fire burned down to embers, my children asking questions about the business, the community, the life I'd built from the ashes of their dismissal. They stayed for 4 days, participating in the same activities as our paying guests, learning to see Alaska through the lens I'd created for visitors, seeking authentic transformation. On their last morning, as Jenny prepared to fly them back to Anchorage, Sarah pulled me aside. I want to bring the girls here this summer, she said. Your granddaughters. I want them to see what their grandmother accomplished. I want them to know that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. They're always welcome. And Mom? I want to be involved, not as a guest, not as your daughter feeling guilty about the past, but as someone who understands what you've built here and wants to help it grow. I looked at Sarah, really looked at her, seeing not the young woman who'd giggled at my dreams, but an adult who'd spent 2 years questioning everything she thought she knew about strength, success, and the courage to change course. What did you have in mind? I run a marketing firm in Chicago. I know digital strategy, brand development, social media. I could help you expand without losing what makes this place special. I could help you tell your story to people who need to hear it, women who think it's too late to start over, families who've forgotten how to value each other's dreams. I felt something warm settle in my chest, not the desperate gratitude of someone starved for family connection, but the solid satisfaction of mutual respect earned through honest reckoning. I'd like that, I said. I'd like that very much. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying my children back to their lives in the lower 48, I stood on the deck watching them disappear into the vast Alaska sky. They would return, not because they felt obligated to visit their eccentric mother who'd run away to the wilderness, but because they'd discovered something here worth preserving. Jenny joined me on the deck, following my gaze toward the horizon where the helicopter had vanished. They get it now, she said. They finally see what you built here. They see what we all built here. This place exists because people believed in something larger than their individual limitations. Speaking of which, Jenny grinned, pulling out her phone, we just got confirmation from the National Geographic documentary crew. They want to feature us in their series about sustainable tourism. Full episode, prime time, international distribution. I looked out at the wilderness that had become my sanctuary, at the business that proved my competence, at the community that valued my contributions rather than taking them for granted. Somewhere in Kansas, Tom was probably reading about my success in magazines he'd never bought when I lived in his house. Somewhere in the world, women were making the same choice I'd made, to bet everything on themselves when everyone else had bet against them. Schedule it, I said. It's time the whole world knew what dead weight can accomplish when it finally stops carrying everyone else. The aurora had begun early tonight, painting the sky in colors that had no names, reminding me that the most beautiful things often happened when you traveled far enough from familiar limitations to discover your own magnificence. I had an empire to run. The news crew arrived on a crisp October morning when the autumn light turned everything to gold, their equipment trucks rumbling down the road that had been nothing but a game trail when I'd first arrived 5 years ago. Now it was paved and maintained, wide enough for the tour buses that brought visitors from around the world to experience what the Wall Street Journal had called the most authentic luxury wilderness retreat in North America. I watched them set up from the main lodge's great room, where I was reviewing the morning's bookings with Sarah, who'd moved to Alaska permanently 6 months ago to manage our expanding operations. My daughter, my partner now, really, had proven to have inherited more than just my eye color. Her marketing campaigns had transformed Northern Lights Sanctuary from a regional secret into an international destination, while somehow preserving the intimate authenticity that made the experience meaningful. "The 60 Minutes crew wants to start with the overview interview," Sarah said, consulting the detailed schedule she'd prepared. "Then they'll film guest activities, staff interviews, and the community impact segment in town. 60 minutes. The call had come 3 months ago, from a producer who'd seen our National Geographic feature and wanted to explore what she called the phenomenon of reinvention in later life. But I knew the real story they were chasing. The woman who'd been dismissed by her own family, then built something so successful it forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions about age, gender, and the courage to change course. The interview took place on the deck overlooking the lake, with the mountains providing a backdrop that made every shot look like a postcard. Correspondent Margaret Brennan, a coincidence of names that hadn't escaped either of our notices, asked the questions I'd been expecting, and a few I hadn't. "Margaret," she said, settling back in her chair while the crew adjusted their equipment. "5 years ago, you were a traditional housewife in Kansas. Today, you run an operation that employs 63 people and generates over $12 million in annual revenue. How do you explain that transformation?" I'd answered versions of this question dozens of times for magazines, documentaries, and the business school students who now used our operation as a case study. But something about the moment, the cameras, the setting, the knowledge that this interview would reach millions of people, made me want to be more honest than I'd ever been publicly. "Margaret, I think most people misunderstand what happened to me. They see it as transformation, as if I became someone completely different, but the truth is, I finally became who I'd always been underneath the expectation." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that managing a household for 35 years gave me exactly the skills needed to run a complex hospitality operation. Coordinating schedules, managing budgets, resolving conflicts, creating experiences that brought people together. I'd been doing all of that for decades. The only difference was that suddenly, I was doing it for people who valued my contributions instead of taking them for granted. But surely starting a business in the Alaska wilderness required skills you didn't have as a housewife." I smiled, thinking about the countless times I'd been asked this question, always phrased in ways that suggested housework was somehow less complex than real business. "Margaret, have you ever tried to get 3 teenagers ready for school while preparing a dinner party for 12, managing a budget that stretched a middle-class income to cover college tuition, and coordinating volunteer schedules for a charity fundraiser that raised $50,000? Because that was a typical Tuesday in my previous life. And your family's reaction to your success?" This was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The story was public knowledge by now. The legal battle, Tom's attempts to have me declared incompetent, the gradual reconciliation with my children. But this was the first time I'd been asked to reflect on it for a national audience. My family loved the woman who made their lives easier. They struggled to accept the woman who made her own life meaningful. That's not unusual. Change is threatening to people who benefit from the status quo, even when that status quo is limiting for everyone involved. "Do you have any contact with your ex-husband?" I paused, thinking about the Christmas card Tom had sent last year, the first communication between us since the divorce was finalized. A simple message: "Congratulations on your success. I hope you're happy." Not an apology exactly, but perhaps the closest he could come to acknowledging what he'd lost when he'd dismissed my dreams as dead weight. Tom and I live very different lives now. I hope he's found peace with his choices, just as I've found peace with mine. And what about other women who might be in similar situations? Women who feel undervalued in their families or marriages? This was why I'd agreed to the interview, why I'd opened my life to this level of scrutiny. Not for the marketing value, our bookings were solid for the next 3 years, but for the women who might be watching from dining rooms where their dreams were treated as inconveniences. I'd tell them that their instincts about their own worth are probably accurate, that if the people around them can't see their value, the problem isn't their vision, it's other people's limitations, and that it's never too late to bet on yourself, even when everyone else is betting against you. After the interview, the crew spent the day filming our operations, guests learning traditional fishing techniques with Jenny, participating in wildlife photography workshops, gathering around fires in the evening to share stories about transformation and discovery. They interviewed staff members about the economic impact on the community, local officials about sustainable tourism, and guests about what they'd found in the Alaska wilderness they couldn't find anywhere else. But it was the final segment that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. The crew had arranged for a video call with a group of women from around the country, viewers of their previous stories about our operation who'd been inspired to make their own major life changes. A woman in her 60s who'd left a suffocating marriage to open an art studio. A 50-year-old who'd quit corporate law to become a wilderness guide. A grandmother who'd used her savings to start a nonprofit serving homeless veterans. "Margaret," one of them said through the screen, "I wanted to thank you, not just for building something beautiful, but for proving that women like us, women who've spent decades serving everyone else, that we're capable of extraordinary things when we're finally free to attempt them." As evening settled over the lake and the camera crews packed their equipment, I walked down to the water's edge where I'd stood that first night, processing the enormity of what I was attempting. The woman who'd made that choice seemed like a stranger now, brave certainly, but also desperate in a way I no longer remembered feeling. Sarah found me there as the aurora began its nightly dance across the sky. "Penny for your thoughts?" she said, settling beside me on the bench I'd installed for guests who needed quiet moments to process their own transformations. I was thinking about that first night, how terrified I was that I'd made a mistake, that maybe your father was right about my capabilities. Any regrets? I considered the question while watching the northern lights paint the sky in colors that still took my breath away after 5 years. The business had grown beyond my wildest dreams, employing 3 times as many people as I'd ever imagined, generating revenue that had made me independently wealthy in ways I'd never expected. But the real success wasn't financial. It was the morning emails from guests whose lives had been changed by their time here, the applications from other women inspired to start their own businesses, the knowledge that I'd proven something important about the untapped potential that existed in lives that looked ordinary from the outside. I regret that it took me 64 years to value myself enough to make this choice, I said finally. I regret the years I spent apologizing for taking up space instead of claiming the space I deserved, but I don't regret leaving or building this or proving that everything they said about me was wrong. "Speaking of which," Sarah said, pulling out her phone, "we just got an email from the White House. They want to discuss featuring our sustainable practices in the President's Economic Development Initiative. Something about rural revitalization and women's entrepreneurship." I laughed, remembering the woman who'd been called dead weight at a family dinner, who'd been threatened with guardianship proceedings, who'd been dismissed as having a breakdown when she'd actually been having a breakthrough. "Schedule it," I said. "But make sure they understand that this isn't just about business success. It's about what happens when people who've been underestimated finally get the chance to show what they're capable of." The aurora danced overhead like applause, and somewhere in the distance I heard the haunting call of loons preparing for their southern migration. In a few hours I'd review tomorrow's schedule, check on guest accommodations, and plan the next phase of our expansion. There was always another challenge, another opportunity, another chance to prove that the most extraordinary things often came from the most unexpected sources. But tonight, I simply sat beside my daughter, watching the wilderness I'd claimed as my own, surrounded by the evidence of what happened when dead weight finally stopped carrying everyone else and started lifting itself. "You know what I discovered out here?" I said to Sarah as we walked back toward the lodge where lights glowed like beacons in windows I'd helped design. "What's that?" "I discovered that I was never dead weight at all. I was just a woman extraordinary enough to carry an entire family for 35 years, so strong that when I finally put them down and started carrying myself, I could build an empire." Sarah smiled, linking her arm through mine as we climbed the steps to the home I'd created entirely through my own vision and determination. "Want to know a secret, Mom? Some of us always knew that. We just forgot to mention it when it would have mattered." Inside the lodge, our evening guests were gathering around the great room fireplace, sharing stories of transformation and possibility, while the wilderness stretched endlessly beyond our windows. vast enough to hold all the dreams that had ever been dismissed, strong enough to support anyone brave enough to build something worth building. I came to Alaska thinking I was running away from a family that didn't value me. I discovered I was running toward a life that finally fit the woman I'd always been underneath their limitations. Some people spend their whole lives being told they're dead weight. I spent 5 years in the wilderness, proving that the heaviest thing I'd ever carried was other people's opinions. Turns out, when you finally put those down, you can carry yourself anywhere. The end.